The wall didn't say help, it didn't say goodbye. It said 4 words that stopped Mason Reed's breathing cold. We did not leave. Nora lifted her flashlight, her hand shaking just enough to make the carved letters tremble. Behind them, Atlas froze. Then came a voice from the cave entrance. That belongs to me. Victor Hale stepped out of the rain, calm as a Sunday preacher, eyes locked on the metal tube in Mason's hands. Mason didn't move. No, he said. It belongs to the people you made everyone forget. And that was when the island finally answered. The island was not empty. It was waiting for Atlas to remember. Mason Reed did not know that when he first saw Black Pine Island through the cracked windshield of his old Ford pickup, sitting far out on Mercy Lake like a dark thought, nobody wanted to speak aloud. He only knew it had cost him $1,000, which was strange enough to feel like mercy and dangerous enough to feel like a trap. 14 acres of pine, stone, and forgotten shoreline for less than the price of a used riding mower. The listing had shown 3 blurry photographs, a crooked dock, and a cabin roof half swallowed by branches. No history, no explanation, just a deed, a phone number, and the kind of silence that makes a man fill in the blanks with hope. Mason was 41, though some mornings his bones voted closer to 60. He had the compact, weathered strength of a man trained to carry more than his share, with gray beginning to gather at his temples and a scar under his jaw that he never explained unless somebody had earned the answer. Once, he had been Sergeant Mason Reed, Army Ranger, the kind of man other men looked to when the night went bad. Now he was just Mason, living out of a pickup with a duffel bag, a dented thermos, and the last creature on earth who still looked at him like he mattered. Atlas sat beside him in the passenger seat, a 9-year-old German shepherd with a charcoal back, amber eyes, and a muzzle silvered by time. He had served with Mason overseas, then come home with a limp in his right hind leg and a loyalty so steady it felt almost holy. Atlas had watched Mason lose his marriage, lose his job, lose the small rental house with the blue door in Vermont, and lose, little by little, the belief that people still saw him as a whole man. The dog had never asked for explanations. He had simply stayed. That morning, as the mountain road curved down toward the lakeside town of Alder Falls, fog drifted low across the water, folding itself around the docks and rooftops. The town looked like a photograph left too long in a drawer. White church on the hill, bait shop with peeling red paint, diner windows glowing weakly against the gray, men in heavy jackets turning their heads as Mason's truck rattled past. He felt their eyes before he met them. He knew the inventory they were taking. Old truck, worn coat, veteran plates, dog, no wedding ring. Too many belongings in the back. Mason kept driving. There are looks that do not insult you directly, yet somehow leave your dignity standing outside in the cold. He had learned not to argue with those looks. At the marina, he parked near a sign that read Hale Boat and Fuel, then stepped out into air sharp enough to wake old pain in his knees. Atlas jumped down after him and stood still. Too still. Mason noticed because Atlas was never careless with stillness. The shepherd's ears lifted toward the lake, his tail lowered, his eyes fixed on Black Pine Island, barely visible through a veil of mist. A low sound gathered in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, but something Mason had heard before, in places where the ground could lie, and empty rooms were not always empty. Mason's hand found the thick fur at the back of Atlas's neck. "Easy, boy," he said softly. Atlas did not look away. Inside the marina office, Victor Hale stood behind the counter, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair combed neatly back, and a face that had learned how to smile without warming. He glanced at Atlas first, then at Mason. "You read? That's right. You're the one bought Black Pine." It was not a question. Mason set the folded deed on the counter. "I'll need a boat across." Victor's fingers rested on the paper but did not take it right away. For one brief second, something passed through his eyes. Not surprise, recognition maybe, or fear dressed up as irritation. "You sure you want to sleep out there?" Mason gave him a tired half-smile. "For $1,000. I don't have many better choices." Victor looked past him, through the salt-streaked window, toward the island. "People don't stay on Black Pine. Why?" Mason asked. Victor finally took the deed, checked the signature, and slid a key across the counter. "Because some places don't want company." Outside, Atlas was still staring across Mercy Lake. The fog shifted, and for a moment the island appeared larger than before, its black pines crowded shoulder to shoulder, its broken dock reaching into the water like a hand that had been waiting too long. Mason stood beside his dog and felt, deep in his chest, the old instinct he had spent years trying to quiet. The sense that a place could be silent and still not be peaceful. He looked down at Atlas. The shepherd's eyes remained locked on the island, bright, troubled, almost familiar. "You know something I don't?" Mason whispered. Atlas gave one slow breath. Then he stepped forward, toward the boat as if the decision had already been made long before Mason ever saw the listing, long before the deed changed hands, long before a broken man with nowhere else to go thought he had bought an island. Behind Mason lay every door that had closed. Ahead waited Black Pine Island, wrapped in fog, holding its secrets beneath pine roots and stone. And somewhere inside that silence, something old had begun to wake. The boat key felt colder than it should have in Mason Reed's palm. He stood outside Hale Boat and Fuel for a moment longer, letting the wind move around him, watching the fog drag itself across Mercy Lake like a curtain no one was ready to lift. Alder Falls had the kind of quiet that looked peaceful from a distance, but felt different once you stood inside it. It was not the honest quiet of the woods or the tired quiet of a man after a long day's work. It was a watching quiet, a measuring quiet, the kind that made Mason aware of the frayed cuffs of his jacket, the mud dried along the sides of his boots, the dent in the pickup's rear panel, the army decal fading in the back window. Across the street, two men outside the diner paused mid-conversation. An elderly woman carrying groceries slowed near the curb and looked at Atlas, then at Mason, then quickly away as if she had been caught reading a private letter. Mason pretended not to notice. Pretending had become one of his last reliable skills. Atlas stood beside him, close enough that his shoulder brushed Mason's leg. The shepherd had finally broken his stare toward the island, but he had not relaxed. His ears kept turning, gathering every small sound, a gull crying over the marina roof, a loose chain tapping against a flagpole, the low creak of boats nudging their ropes. Mason looked down at him. "Yeah," he murmured. "I feel it too." He crossed to the diner because the coffee in his thermos had gone bitter hours ago, and because a man about to sleep on an abandoned island ought to enter it warm if he could. A bell above the door gave a tired jingle. Conversation inside thinned, not enough to stop, only enough to make room for suspicion. The place smelled of bacon grease, old wood, and raincoats drying on hooks. A waitress with kind eyes and silver hair looked him over, then glanced at Atlas through the window. "Service dog?" she asked, not sharply. "Retired military working dog," Mason said. "He waits outside unless invited." Something in her face softened, then he's invited. Long as he behaves better than Earl over there. A man at the counter grunted without looking up. Mason almost smiled. Almost. Atlas entered quietly and settled beneath the small corner table Mason chose, his body angled toward the door. The waitress poured coffee before Mason asked. Her name tag read Linda. "You passing through?" she said. Mason wrapped both hands around the mug. The heat felt almost embarrassing in its kindness. "Not exactly." Linda waited. People in small towns were good at making silence do the asking. "Bought Black Pine Island," Mason said. The spoon she was holding clicked once against the coffee pot. At the counter, Earl stopped chewing. A younger man in a plaid jacket turned his head. For 2 full seconds, even the kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Linda recovered first, but not cleanly. "That's so, that's so. Victor sell it to you?" Paperwork came through a broker. Victor gave me the boat key. Earl gave a low laugh that had no humor in it. Broker must not believe in full disclosure. Mason looked at him. "Meaning?" Earl lifted his mug, then thought better of whatever he'd been about to say. "Meaning weather turns fast on the lake." Linda shot him a look, then set a plate of toast in front of Mason though he had not ordered food. "On the house," she said. He wanted to refuse. Pride rose in him quickly, old and automatic like a guard dog of its own. But he saw no pity in her eyes, only plain decency. So he nodded once. "Thank you, Mom." That seemed to matter to her. Maybe manners were one of the few currencies he still had plenty of. A man could lose an address, a paycheck, a marriage, even the version of himself people once applauded, and still hold a door open, still say thank you, still treat a stranger like a person. Mason had begun to believe the world forgot that, or maybe he had. When he stepped back outside, the wind had sharpened, pushing ripples across the lake. A county truck rolled slowly along the marina road and stopped near his pickup. A woman climbed out wearing a green field jacket and a ranger-style cap. her dark blonde hair pulled back, her posture calm but not casual. She studied the Ford, the loaded truck bed, Atlas, then Mason. Unlike the others, she did not look away when their eyes met. Mason Reed? Depends who's asking. Nora Whitcomb, County Wildlife Officer. She held out a hand. Her grip was firm, warm through the cold. I heard someone bought Black Pine. News travels quick here. Bad news travels quicker. Mason glanced toward the lake. Buying land is bad news? Nora followed his gaze. The island was a shadow now, half erased by fog. Not always, her voice lowered. But Black Pine has a way of returning what people try to leave there. Atlas rose then, slowly, and turned toward the water again. The hair along his back lifted just enough for Mason to see. Nora noticed too. Her expression changed, not with fear but recognition. "That dog," she said softly, "doesn't like the island." Mason rested a hand on Atlas's head. "He usually has a reason." Nora looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he deserved the truth or just another warning. "Then before you go out there," she said, "there's something you need to know." Nora Whitcomb did not speak right away. She stood with Mason at the edge of the marina parking lot, one hand resting on the open door of her county truck, her eyes fixed on the shape of Black Pine Island beyond the fog. The wind moved through Alder Falls in small, restless breaths, carrying the smell of lake water, diesel fuel, wet rope, and something older Mason could not name. Behind them, the diner bell jingled as someone stepped out, then went quiet again. It seemed the whole town had a habit of listening without admitting it. Mason waited. He had learned in the army and afterward that people revealed more in the pauses than in the sentences. Nora finally turned toward him. Up close, he could see she was younger than the hardness in her expression made her seem, late 30s maybe, with tired blue eyes that had spent too many winters watching people make the same mistakes and call them weather. "Did the broker tell you anything about the Weller family?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "Only that the island had been empty for years." Nora gave a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. "That's one way to say it." Atlas stood between them and the lake, body angled toward Black Pine, ears lifted, his gaze so steady it made Mason's skin tighten beneath his collar. Nora noticed every inch of him. "He's retired military, 9 years old, name's Atlas, bomb detection at first, later search work. That explains the eyes." Mason looked at her. "What about them?" Nora's voice softened. "He's not looking at that island like it's strange. He's looking at it like it owes him something." Mason did not answer. The remark settled too neatly beside the feeling he had been trying to ignore. Nora reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out a folded map of Mercy Lake, and spread it against the hood of her truck. Her finger found Black Pine Island, a crooked patch of land in the center of dark blue water. 18 years ago, 3 people lived there. Edwin Weller, his wife Marion, and Edwin's younger brother Samuel. Good people, quiet. Not rich, not connected, not the kind of folks who had anyone powerful checking in on them. Mason studied the map. They owned the place? Outright. Edwin built most of the cabin himself. Marion taught school here for 30 years. Samuel was a Vietnam veteran, kept to himself after he came home. But he fixed radios, repaired boat engines, helped people when they asked and disappeared when they didn't. She paused, as if choosing her next words carefully. Then one October storm came through. Bad one. Power out across half the county. By morning, the Wellers were gone. Mason lifted his eyes. Gone how? No note. No confirmed ferry ride. No clean sail. No bodies. No explanation that ever satisfied anyone with a conscience. Across the road, Victor Hale appeared outside the marina office, pretending to adjust a rack of life jackets. Mason saw him glance their way once, then twice. Nora lowered her voice. Officially, people said they left. Maybe debts. Maybe family trouble. Maybe Samuel had some sort of episode, and the others followed. Pick an ugly rumor and someone in this town repeated it. Mason felt his jaw tighten, and unofficially, people were afraid to ask why the story changed depending on who told it. A gull cried overhead, sharp and lonely. Mason looked out at Black Pine. The island seemed almost peaceful from here. That bothered him more than if it had looked menacing. Peaceful places could hide almost anything if people agreed not to look too closely. Nora folded the map but kept it in her hand. "I'm not telling you this to scare you off. Victor already tried that. Victor likes people scared. It saves him from explaining himself." Mason turned back to her. "What does he have to do with it?" Nora's expression closed slightly, not from distrust, but from the caution of someone who had learned that truth without proof could be made to look like bitterness. 18 years ago, Victor Hale sat on the town council. He also handled private land deals around Mercy Lake. Resort groups were sniffing around back then. Black Pine was the cleanest parcel on the water, and the Wellers wouldn't sell. Mason absorbed that quietly. There it was, land, money, silence. 3 old ingredients in a very American kind of disappearance. Atlas gave a low breath and shifted closer to Mason's knee. Nora saw the movement. "Mr. Reed, I don't know what you bought. A property? Maybe. A problem, probably. But if you go out there, do not assume the past is finished, just because people stopped speaking of it." Mason gave a small nod. "Didn't buy it for the history." "No," Nora said, her eyes moving over his truck, his coat, the careful way he carried exhaustion without asking anyone to help lift it. "I imagine you bought it because you needed somewhere people would stop deciding who you were before you opened your mouth." The sentence found him too cleanly. Mason looked away first. For a moment, all he could hear was rope knocking against dock posts and Atlas breathing beside him. Nora's voice became gentler. "The Wellers deserved better than rumors. So do you." Mason swallowed once, slowly. He had been thanked for his service by strangers who never looked him in the eye. He had been pitied, ignored, and politely avoided. But this was different. Nora had not praised him. She had simply seen him. That made it harder to stand there than any insult would have. From the marina office, Victor called out, "Weather won't hold all day." Mason looked toward the island. The fog thinned just enough to reveal the broken dock and the black pines rising behind it. Atlas stepped forward, not eager, not afraid, certain. Mason tucked the boat key into his pocket. "Then I guess we go before it turns." Nora handed him the folded map. "Keep your radio charged." "And Mason?" He looked back. "If Atlas refuses a path, believe him." Mason looked down at his dog. Atlas's amber eyes reflected the lake, the fog, and something Mason could not yet understand. "I always do," he said. The boat left Alder Falls with a reluctant cough from the motor, pushing away from the marina as if even the machine had doubts. Mason Reed stood near the stern with one hand on the rail and the other resting lightly on Atlas's back. Mercy Lake spread around them in a dark, unsettled sheet, its surface broken by small silver ripples that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Behind him, the town receded into fog, the diner windows, the fuel sign, Victor Hale's narrow figure by the office door, and Nora Whitcomb standing beside her county truck with her arms folded against the cold. Mason did not wave, neither did she. Some goodbyes were not goodbyes at all, just warnings given shape. Atlas stood with his front paws planted wide, nose lifted, ears forward. The wind pressed against his fur, but he did not blink. The closer the boat came to Black Pine Island, the more Mason felt the dog change beneath his hand. Not fear exactly. Fear scattered the body, made it restless. Atlas grew more focused, more certain, like a compass needle finding north after years in a drawer. The island rose ahead of them, larger now, darker now, its shoreline armored with wet stone and roots that twisted down into the lake like old fingers. Pines crowded every slope, tall and black-green, their trunks close together as if guarding something too tired to run. The broken dock waited in a small cove on the southern side, tilted but still standing. Mason guided the boat in slowly, the hull knocking once against a rubber bumper someone had tied there long ago. The sound moved through the fog and came back softer, older. "Home sweet home," Mason muttered, though the words felt wrong the moment he said them. Atlas stepped onto the dock before Mason could reach for his leash. He did not sniff aimlessly like a dog exploring new ground. He paused, lowered his head, took in the air, and turned not toward the cabin visible through the trees, but toward a narrow deer trail disappearing east into the pines. Mason frowned. "Cabin's this way, pal." Atlas did not move. He looked back once, eyes steady, then started up the trail. Mason stood there with the duffel strap over his shoulder, the folded map in his coat pocket, and the uneasy sense that the dog had been waiting for this argument and already knew he would win. "Fine," Mason said quietly. "Lead on." The trail climbed through wet ferns and fallen needles. Every step released the smell of earth, lake rot, and cold sap. The trees swallowed the dock within minutes. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. The silence was not empty. It was packed tight, layered with things withheld. Atlas moved slowly, not because of his old limp, but because he was reading the ground. He stopped at a split in the path, ignored the wider trail, and pushed through a screen of young spruce toward a rise of moss-covered stone. Mason followed, branches brushing his sleeves, water dripping from needles onto the back of his neck. At the top of the rise stood a white pine thicker than any Mason had seen in years. Its lower bark was scarred not recently, but deeply, as if time had tried and failed to heal it. Atlas circled the tree once, then began pawing gently at the moss near its roots. Not frantic, deliberate. Mason set down the duffel and crouched beside him. "What have you got?" Atlas cleared away pine needles with careful strokes. Mason used his fingers to lift the damp moss. At first there was only black soil, a few stones, a line of pale roots. Then something metallic flashed beneath his thumb. He dug around it and pulled free a small, rusted tag, oval-shaped, its chain broken, its surface greened by weather. He wiped it on his jeans. The letters were faint but readable, R. Keller K9 Unit. Mason stared at it longer than he meant to. The island wind moved through the branches overhead with a low wooden sigh. "K9 Unit," he whispered. Atlas sat back on his haunches, gaze fixed on the tag as if it were not a discovery but a confirmation. Mason turned it over. On the back, scratched by hand, were 3 letters, RGR Ranger. Nora had not mentioned a dog, neither had Victor. No listing, no county record. No polite warning had included the fact that someone connected to a working dog had once stood beneath this tree and left behind a piece of metal that should not have been here. Mason slipped the tag into his pocket, but the weight of it seemed to remain in his hand. Atlas rose and looked deeper into the forest. Beyond the pine, through a narrow break in the trees, Mason could see the roof of the cabin at last, sagging beneath years of weather, its windows dark, its porch leaning toward the ground like an old man trying to kneel. For a second, Mason felt the absurd urge to apologize before entering. Not because the place frightened him, because it felt occupied by memory. He and Atlas made their way down toward it. At the cabin door, Mason found old scratch marks carved into the lower wood, long grooves worn smooth by time. Atlas lowered his nose to them, then gave a soft sound from deep in his throat. Mason placed his palm against the door and felt cold through the grain. Whatever Black Pine Island was, it was not cheap land. It was not a clean start. It was a question with trees growing over it, and Atlas somehow had begun answering before Mason even knew what to ask. The cabin door opened with a tired groan, and Mason Reed stepped into a room that smelled of damp wood, cold ashes and time left unattended. Atlas entered first, not rushing, not wandering, but crossing the threshold with the slow caution of a soldier, entering a place where silence had weight. The cabin was smaller than Mason expected. One main room, a stone fireplace blackened by old smoke, a table with one leg braced by a stack of yellowed magazines, shelves bowed under empty jars. Curtains, gray with dust, hung stiff in the windows, letting in just enough afternoon light to make every corner look bruised. Mason set his duffel near the wall and stood there, listening. The lake wind pushed against the boards. Somewhere above him, a loose strip of tin tapped softly against the roof. Tap, 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 like a patient finger. "Well," he said under his breath, "it's got character." Atlas did not appreciate the joke. He walked to the center of the room and stopped over a section of floorboards near the fireplace. His head lowered. His nose moved once along a seam in the wood. Then he looked back at Mason. That look had carried them through too many hard nights to ignore. Mason knelt, pressing his palm against the boards. They were warped from moisture, but one plank sat differently from the rest. Its edge cut a little too clean, its nails older than the boards around it. He pulled the small pry bar from his tool bag and worked slowly, careful not to split the wood more than time already had. The plank lifted with a soft crack. Beneath it was darkness, shallow but deliberate, a hiding place. Mason reached inside and touched oilcloth. His fingers closed around a small tin box, cold and gritty with dust. He brought it into the light. Atlas sat beside him, so close his shoulder leaned against Mason's arm. Inside the box lay a woman's journal wrapped in faded blue cloth, a hand-drawn map of Black Pine Island, 3 brittle photographs, and an envelope addressed to the county clerk but never mailed. Mason opened the first photograph. A gray-haired man stood beside the cabin porch, one hand resting on a hammer. A woman with kind, steady eyes stood next to him, her hair pinned back, her smile modest but real. Beside them sat another man, thinner, unsmiling, wearing an old field jacket. At their feet was a German shepherd with a dark saddle coat and proud ears. On the back, written in blue ink, were the names: Edwin, Marion, Samuel, and Ranger. Mason felt Atlas shift. The old shepherd leaned forward and sniffed the photograph, then gave a small sound Mason had never heard from him before, quiet and almost sorrowful. Mason opened Marion's journal. The handwriting was neat, patient, the kind produced by someone who believed words deserved respect. At first, the entries were ordinary: weather, repairs, Edwin's bad knee, Samuel fixing the radio, Ranger chasing gulls from the dock. Then, little by little, the tone changed. Men came asking about the island, offers arrived, then pressure, then rumors. Marion wrote that people in town had begun looking at them differently, as if refusing to sell made them selfish, unstable, ungrateful. One entry made Mason stop breathing for a moment. The easiest way to steal from a person is to convince everyone they are not worth listening to. He read it twice, then a third time. The room around him seemed to fall away. He thought of diner glances, closed doors, job interviews that ended when employers saw his address was temporary, the polite smile people wore when they thanked him for his service and then stepped around his need. He had not been stolen from the way the Wellers had, not exactly, but he knew what it felt like to have people decide your value before hearing your voice. Atlas rested his chin on Mason's knee. Mason placed one hand on the dog's head and kept reading. Marion had written about Samuel, how the town called him strange because he preferred quiet, because war had changed the way he moved through crowds, because some nights he walked the shoreline until dawn. But she refused to reduce him to whispers. "My brother-in-law is not broken," she wrote. "He is carrying things most people are lucky enough not to understand." Mason closed his eyes. The words entered him gently, which somehow made them hurt more. In the envelope were copies of land offers, names of council members, and a final letter asking the county to investigate harassment around the property. At the bottom, Marion had written one sentence in darker ink: "If anything happens to us, ask why they needed us silent." Outside, the wind rose through the pines. Atlas lifted his head toward the door, ears forward. Mason gathered the journal, the map, and the photographs back into the tin, but he did not put them under the floor again. Some things were hidden to protect them. Some things were hidden because people were afraid, and some things, once found, had to be carried into the light. By dusk, Blackpine Island had changed its face. The same trees that had stood solemn in the afternoon now leaned into the dark like witnesses unwilling to speak. Mason Reed sat at the old table inside the cabin, Marion Weller's journal open beneath the yellow beam of his flashlight, while Atlas lay near the door with his head raised and his ears doing the work of a second pair of eyes. Rain had begun tapping against the roof, soft at first, then steadier, threading through the loose tin and the tired boards with a sound like fingers searching for a way in. Mason had spent the last hour reading and rereading the final pages. Names appeared more than once: Victor Hale, Alder Falls Council, Mercy Lake Development Group. Words like easement, access rights, voluntary transfer, nuisance complaint, polite language, clean language, the kind people used when they wanted greed to wear a tie. He took photos of each page with his phone, then tucked the journal inside his jacket instead of leaving it in the tin. Something about the cabin no longer felt private, it felt watched. Atlas gave a low breath. Mason lifted his head. "You hear it too?" The shepherd stood, not hurried, not panicked. He turned toward the back wall, where an old window looked out into the trees. Mason switched off the flashlight. Darkness filled the cabin at once. Through the rain-streaked glass, far beyond the porch, a pale light moved between the pines. Once, twice, then it vanished. Mason stayed still. He had known darkness in other countries, in other years, under skies that had no mercy in them. But this was different. This was not the danger of a battlefield. This was the danger of a secret growing nervous. He waited until the light did not return, then stepped quietly to the window. The woods gave him nothing. Only rain, trunks, and the black shape of branches moving against a low sky. Atlas stood pressed beside him, body calm, eyes hard. "Not alone out here," Mason whispered. The next morning, he took the first boat back to Alder Falls with the journal wrapped in a towel under his coat. The lake was rougher than before, choppy and gray, and Blackpine seemed to shrink behind him as if it disliked being left with one less secret. Nora Whitcomb met him near the public dock, coffee in one hand, concern already written across her face before he said a word. They sat in her county truck while rain blurred the windshield. And Mason showed her the photographs, the letter, the entries with Victor's name. Nora did not interrupt. She read Marion's sentence about silence twice, then looked away toward the marina office across the lot. I knew Victor was involved in the pressure campaign, she said quietly. I never had anything that tied him this close. Pressure campaign, Mason repeated. That's a gentle phrase. Nora nodded, accepting the correction without defending herself. You're right. They made decent people look unstable so no one would care what happened to them. Mason watched Victor through the wet glass. He was outside now, speaking with a man in a raincoat, smiling the polished smile of a person who believed reputation could waterproof anything. He saw us yesterday, Mason said. Someone was on the island last night. Nora's jaw tightened. You need to keep those documents somewhere safe. Already copied them. For the first time that morning, she almost smiled. Good. As Mason stepped out of the truck, Victor called from across the marina, Mr. Reed. The voice carried easily over the rain. Friendly, too friendly. Mason turned. Victor walked toward him with a folded newspaper under one arm and a cup of coffee he had not been drinking. Hope the old place didn't treat you too badly. Mason held his gaze. It needs work. Some places do. Victor glanced at Atlas. The dog stood between them, not growling, simply present. That seemed to bother Victor more than a bark would have. Black Pine has a sad history, Victor said. Folks around here learned to let it rest. History doesn't rest because people get tired of hearing it. Victor's smile thinned. Careful. A man in your position ought to know the difference between a fresh start and borrowing someone else's trouble. The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Mason's truck, his worn coat, the fact that he had bought the cheapest land in the county because the world had priced him out of everything else. For a moment, shame rose in him, familiar and bitter. Then Atlas leaned against his leg, steady as a hand on the shoulder. Mason looked back at Victor. A man in my position knows what it feels like when people stop listening before you speak. Victor's eyes cooled. Black Pine won't give you what you're looking for. Maybe not, Mason said. But I'm starting to think it gave me what someone else tried to hide. Later, when he returned to the island, the cabin door was open. Mason knew he had latched it. Inside, the room had been searched, but carefully, almost respectfully, as if the intruder wanted to leave doubt behind instead of damage. The tin box was gone from under the lifted plank. The table had been moved. The loose boards checked. Mason stood in the center of the room and let the anger pass through him without steering him. Atlas crossed to the bed, nosed beneath it, and pulled out Marion's journal, still wrapped in the towel where Mason had hidden it before leaving. Mason crouched and took it with both hands. The old dog's eyes met his, calm and bright. Not everything precious had been taken. Not this time. Nora Whitcomb did not take Mason to the police station. She did not take him to the county office either. Not yet, she said, guiding her truck away from the marina and through the narrow back roads of Alder Falls, where old maples leaned over stone walls and rainwater ran silver along the ditches. Atlas sat in the rear seat, head high, eyes moving from window to window. Mason kept Marion's journal inside his coat, one hand resting over it as if warmth alone could keep the past from being stolen again. They drove north of town, past the last gas station, past a cemetery on a hill, past fields gone brown under the low November sky. Finally, Nora turned onto a gravel lane that ended at a small house tucked beside a stand of birch trees. The house looked clean but tired, with peeling blue shutters, a stacked woodpile under a tarp, and a porch light glowing though it was barely afternoon. Thomas Weller lives here, Nora said. Mason looked at her. Weller? Edwin's cousin. He worked around the lake years ago, boat repairs, dock maintenance, odd jobs. He was one of the last people who saw them before they disappeared. Why didn't you mention him before? Nora's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Because Thomas has spent 18 years learning how not to speak. The front door opened before they reached the porch. Thomas Weller stood in the doorway, thin and stooped, with white hair combed carefully to one side and a flannel shirt buttoned all the way to the throat. He looked like a man who apologized to furniture when he bumped into it. His eyes moved to Nora first, then Mason, then Atlas. At the sight of the dog, something in his face shifted so quickly Mason almost missed it. Not fear, recognition's older brother grief. No, Thomas whispered. Nora stepped forward gently. Thomas, this is Mason Reed. He bought Black Pine. The old man's mouth tightened. Then he should sell it. I found Marion's journal, Mason said. Thomas closed his eyes. The rain ticked softly on the porch roof. For a while no one moved. Then Atlas took one slow step forward, stopping at the edge of the porch as if asking permission from a house full of sorrow. Thomas looked down at him. His hand trembled at his side. "He looks like Ranger," he said. Mason felt the name move through him like a match struck in a dark room. "You knew the dog?" Thomas gave a small, broken laugh. Everybody knew Ranger, better manners than most people in town. He opened the door wider. "Come in before the weather gets mean inside." The house smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and old paper. Thomas moved slowly to the kitchen table, where a radio sat beside a stack of neatly folded newspapers. Atlas approached him without command, without hurry, and rested his head against the old man's knee. Thomas's hand hovered over the shepherd's ears, afraid to touch and afraid not to. When he finally did, his shoulders folded inward and the tears came silently. Mason looked away, not out of discomfort, but respect. Some grief deserved privacy even when witnessed. Thomas wiped his face with a handkerchief and stared at the table. "I should have said something." Nora sat across from him. "You said what you could." "No," he replied, voice rough but clear. "I said what cost me nothing." The room went still. Thomas told them about the night of the storm 18 years earlier. He had been working late at the marina, repairing a fuel line, when he saw a boat leave Blackpine after midnight. No running lights, no proper radio call. The lake was too rough for casual travel. In the morning, Victor Hale told people the Wellers had gone away, that Samuel had become unstable, that Edwin was tired of fighting over land, that Marion wanted a quieter life somewhere else. He made it sound reasonable, Thomas said. That was the worst part. Cruelty doesn't always shout. Sometimes it wears a clean coat and says everything is for the best. A few days later, Ranger appeared near the north dock, wet, limping, and exhausted. Thomas tried to get help. People told him it was only a dog. They told him not to stir up trouble. Victor warned him that a man with no savings and no family should be careful about accusing respected citizens. Thomas had a small house then, a job he needed, and a mind already tired from years of being dismissed as odd. "So I kept quiet," he said. "I didn't lie. I just let their lie stand. Took me 18 years to understand silence can become a kind of lie too." Mason looked at the old man and saw not cowardice, but the damage done when a community teaches certain people that their voice is too small to matter. He opened Marion's journal and placed the photograph of Ranger on the table. Atlas lifted his head, sniffed it once, then looked toward the rain-dark window as if listening to a sound no human could hear. Thomas pointed with a shaking finger to a mark on Marion's map near the island's northern cliffs. If she hid anything important, it would be there. Edwin called it the Stone Throat, a cave. Hard to find unless someone showed you. Nora leaned closer. "Can you mark it?" Thomas nodded. His hand was unsteady, but this time it did not stop. The rain stopped just before dawn, but the island did not feel washed clean. It felt exposed. Mason Reed brought the boat across Mercy Lake with Nora Whitcomb beside him and Atlas standing between them, nose lifted into the wet morning air. Behind them, Alder Falls was still waking, its windows dim, its streets shining from the night storm. Ahead, Blackpine Island waited under a low ceiling of gray cloud, every pine dark with water, every rock slick and cold. Thomas Weller had not come with them. His hands had trembled too badly when he marked the old map, and Mason had seen what that small act had cost him. Still, Thomas's pencil mark lay clear near the northern cliffs, circled twice, with 2 words written beside it in careful, shaking letters, Stone Throat. Mason kept thinking about that name as they tied the boat to a narrow strip of shore far from the broken dock. The northern side of the island was rougher, less welcoming, where granite pushed up from the earth in hard gray shoulders and roots gripped the slopes like knuckles. Atlas moved first, not pulling, not rushing, but following something older than the map. Nora walked behind him, with her radio clipped high on her jacket, her boots steady on the wet ground. Mason carried Marion's journal in a sealed bag inside his coat, close enough that he could feel its edges press against his ribs. It felt less like evidence than responsibility. They climbed through spruce and black pine, past moss-covered stones and fallen branches silvered by rain. Twice Nora checked the map. Twice, Atlas ignored the path she chose and angled higher toward the cliffs. Mason said nothing. By now he understood that the dog was not guessing. Near the ridge, Atlas stopped at a wall of brush so thick it looked natural, then pushed his nose beneath a curtain of roots. He gave one low breath. Mason crouched and saw it. A dark opening behind the growth, narrow and low, almost hidden by years of leaf fall and storm wash. Cold air moved from it, damp and mineral, carrying the smell of stone, old water, and something sealed away too long. Nora pulled back the branches with gloved hands. Thomas was right, she said. Mason switched on his flashlight. The beam entered the cave and seemed to shrink. Atlas stepped in first. Mason followed, then Nora. Inside, the world changed. The rain sounds disappeared, the trees disappeared, even the lake seemed far away. The cave curved inward like a throat indeed, its walls wet and close, its floor sloping gently down. Their lights found small things before they found the truth. A rusted lantern, a cracked enamel cup, a strip of cloth caught beneath a stone. Old boot prints preserved in a patch of dried silt where water had once risen and retreated. No ghosts, no curse, just evidence, patient and unromantic. Atlas stopped near a flat section of wall. His ears lowered, he did not whine, but Mason felt sorrow enter the space as plainly as cold. On the stone, scratched by a tool or perhaps by the edge of the lantern, were 3 names: Edwin, Marion, Samuel. Below them, carved with less steadiness but deeper force, were 4 words: "We did not leave." Nora covered her mouth with one hand. Mason stood very still, his flashlight trembling only slightly. There are sentences that do not need decoration. This one had waited 18 years in darkness and still had enough strength to break the room open. Nearby, tucked into a dry crack above the old waterline, Mason found a metal document tube. He passed it to Nora and she opened it with careful hands. Inside were folded papers, brittle but protected. Copies of land offers, a written statement from Marion, a list of meetings she had recorded, and a final note explaining that certain men had come again demanding signatures. The note did not describe cruelty in dramatic words. It described pressure, isolation, threats wrapped in legal phrases, the slow erasing of decent people by those who knew exactly how to sound respectable. Mason thought of Victor Hale's clean coat, his polished voice, the way he had warned Mason about borrowing someone else's trouble. Maybe that was what injustice counted on, that every generation would call it someone else's trouble until no one was left to answer for it. Atlas moved to another corner of the cave and lowered his nose beside a rusted chain fixed near the rock. Attached to it was a small leather collar, stiff with age. Mason knelt and saw the faint stamped letters, Ranger. He did not touch it right away. Instead, he bowed his head not from ceremony, but from instinct. A working dog had once tried to carry the truth out of this place. A whole town had failed to listen. Nora's voice came quietly from behind him. "We have enough to reopen it." Mason looked back at the carved words on the wall. "Not enough," he said. "Enough for the law, maybe, but not enough for them." Nora understood the truth did not only need filing, it needed honoring. Outside the cave, the clouds began to break, and a thin blade of morning light slipped through the hidden entrance. Atlas turned toward it first, his old eyes bright in the gray. Mason followed him out slowly, carrying the document tube as if it were something alive. Black Pine Island had not been cursed. It had been misnamed, misjudged, and left alone with the truth because people found rumors easier than respect. But now the island had spoken. Or maybe, at last, someone had listened. The storm came back before noon, not with thunder at first, but with a hush so deep it made the island seem to be holding its breath. Mason Reed felt it as he stepped out of the cave with Nora Whitcomb behind him, and Atlas at his side, the metal document tube tucked inside his coat. Mercy Lake had turned the color of gunmetal. Across the water, Alder Falls had disappeared behind a moving wall of rain. The pines bent slowly, their black tops swaying together, whispering over the cliffs like a crowd that had waited 18 years for the courage to speak. Mason looked down at Atlas. The shepherd's ears were low, his eyes bright and fixed beyond the brush, not toward the boat, toward the ridge above the cave. "Someone's here," Mason said. Nora's hand moved to her radio, but before she could speak, Victor Hale stepped from between 2 wet pines wearing a long dark raincoat and the same careful expression he had worn at the marina, as if he had merely arrived for an appointment. Water ran from the brim of his cap. His face looked older out here, stripped of the warm lights and polished counters that helped men like him seem respectable. "You should have taken the fresh start, Mr. Reed," Victor said. His voice was calm, which made it worse. Calm had always been the costume of men who believed consequences were for other people. Nora lifted her chin. Victor, this is over. He glanced at the document tube beneath Mason's coat, then at the cave behind them. No. What's over is a sad little rumor that should have stayed where it was. Mason felt anger rise, but it did not burn hot. It came cold, clean, steady. He thought of Marian's handwriting, Samuel's name carved into stone, Thomas Weller's trembling hand marking the map, Ranger's collar waiting in the dark. They were people, Mason said, not a rumor. Victor's jaw tightened. They were stubborn. They were standing in the way of something this town needed. A resort? Nora asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. Tax money, jobs, growth. Victor looked past them toward the hidden mouth of the cave. You have no idea what it was like then. Alder Falls was dying. Every business on that street was one bad winter from closing. Mason took one step forward, slowly, not threatening, simply refusing to shrink. Atlas moved with him. A town that saves itself by erasing people doesn't save itself. It just teaches everyone who can be erased next. For the first time, Victor's calm fractured. You think you understand because you slept in a truck and wore a uniform? You came here with nothing and bought what no one wanted. Don't mistake that for purpose. The words struck close, but they did not enter the way they might have a week earlier. Mason looked at Atlas, then back at Victor. No, I bought a place people were afraid to respect. There's a difference. Nora's radio crackled with static. The storm rolled harder over the ridge, and rain began falling in thick silver ropes. From inside the cave came a deep sound, not loud but final, stone shifting underwater. Atlas snapped toward it and barked once. Nora turned. The lower passage is flooding. Mason looked toward the slope below. The trail they had climbed was already turning to mud, water cutting fast channels through leaves and loose soil. Victor looked suddenly uncertain, his eyes moving from the cave to the trees to the lake he could no longer see. The north trail washes out, Nora said. We need to move. My boat's on the south side, Mason replied. Too far in this weather. Atlas was already moving. He pushed past the brush, not downhill but along the cliff wall, following a narrow shelf Mason would never have noticed. Every few steps, the dog looked back. Come on, believe me. Mason did, Nora did too. Victor hesitated only until the ground gave a soft slide behind him. Then he followed, no longer dignified, no longer in control, just another frightened man in the rain. The ledge narrowed beneath dripping stone and bent pines. Mason's boots slipped twice. Nora caught his sleeve once, and he caught a root the second time. No one spoke. All the polite lies of Alder Falls had been reduced to breath, mud, and the old dog choosing the way. Then the ledge ended at a split in the rock where cold air rushed outward. Atlas lowered himself through first, despite the stiffness in his bad leg. Mason's chest tightened. Atlas, wait. The shepherd looked back, wet fur clinging to his face, amber eyes steady. Mason understood the look. He had followed it through worse than weather. He climbed after him. The passage was tight, but it curved downward to a sheltered hollow above the western shore. By the time they emerged, Nora's radio finally caught a signal. She called it in, voice firm over the storm. Evidence recovered, suspects present, immediate assistance required at Black Pine Island. Victor stood a few feet away, rain running down his face, all his careful power washing into the mud. He did not confess again. He did not need to. Nora's recorder had been running since the cave. Mason knelt beside Atlas, who had lowered himself onto the wet stones, breathing hard but calm. The shepherd's right hind leg trembled from the climb. Mason placed both hands on either side of his face. You got us out, old man, he whispered, his voice breaking despite every wall he had built around it. Atlas leaned his forehead into Mason's chest. In the distance, through rain and fog, sirens began to sound across Mercy Lake. Mason looked toward the hidden cave, toward the trees, toward the island that had never been haunted by ghosts, only by what living people refused to admit. For the first time since he arrived, Black Pine did not feel like a place waiting to swallow him. It felt like a place exhaling. By spring, the lake no longer looked like the same lake. Mercy Lake had thawed slowly, reluctantly, releasing winter one silver sheet at a time, until the water opened beneath the sky and carried the reflection of Black Pine Island without fog hiding its edges. The pines were still dark, the rocks were still cold. The old cabin still leaned a little to the left when the wind came hard from the west. But something had changed, not loudly. Not the way newspapers like to say a town changes. It changed in quieter ways, in lowered eyes, in careful apologies, in people who had repeated rumors for 18 years suddenly learning how heavy a rumor could become when truth finally stood beside it. Victor Hale's name disappeared from the marina sign first. Then it disappeared from the town council photographs. The investigation moved through Alder Falls like a long-delayed tide, uncovering papers, signatures, old favors, and the polished little lies that had kept decent people buried under doubt. Mason Reed did not follow every hearing. He gave his statement. Nora gave hers. Thomas Weller, with Atlas lying at his feet, gave his in a voice that shook at the beginning and steadied by the end. When he finished, he did not look smaller, the way shame had made him look when Mason first met him. He looked tired, yes, but lighter, as if speaking had not erased 18 years, only stopped them from taking one more day. The town held the memorial on Black Pine Island in May, when wild lupine grew along the trail and the air smelled of pine resin and wet stone. There were no grand speeches. Mason had refused that. Nora agreed. Thomas insisted Marion would have hated anything too fancy. So they gathered near the old white pine where Atlas had found the rusted tag, and a small bronze plaque was set into a slab of local granite. It read Edwin, Marion, and Samuel Weller. They did not disappear, they were feraled. May we listen better. Mason stood behind the small crowd with Atlas beside him, one hand resting on the shepherd's broad head. He watched Linda from the diner wipe her eyes with a napkin she had brought in her purse. He watched Earl, who once laughed into his coffee, remove his cap and stare at the ground like a man finally meeting his own words. He watched Thomas place one weathered hand on the plaque, his fingers lingering over Marion's name. No one rushed him. That, Mason thought, was a kind of respect, too. Afterward, people drifted back toward the boats. But Mason stayed. Nora stayed with him. Together they walked to the cabin, where the broken porch had been rebuilt, the windows repaired, and the door sanded smooth except for the old scratch marks at the bottom. Mason had kept them. Some marks were not damage, some were testimony. Over the next months, Black Pine Island became something no one in Alder Falls expected. Mason did not sell it to developers. He did not turn it into a private retreat for people with more money than quiet. He opened it slowly, carefully, with Nora's help and Thomas's blessing, as a place for those who needed space to become human again without being asked to explain every scar. Veterans came first, men and women who still stood with their backs to walls, who knew how to survive a hard night but had forgotten how to receive a gentle morning. Then came retired working dogs, old shepherds and labs, and hounds with cloudy eyes, stiff legs, and hearts still trained to serve. Later, elderly neighbors from Alder Falls began visiting on Saturdays, not as charity cases, not as projects, but as guests. They brought soup, stories, tools, flowers, silence. Mason named the place the Black Pine House. On the first sign he carved by hand, he wrote only 5 words beneath the name: "Everyone deserves to be heard." Some evenings, when the sun lowered behind Mercy Lake and turned the water copper, Mason sat on the porch with Atlas stretched beside his boots. The dog's limp had worsened a little after the storm, but his spirit had not. He still lifted his head at every distant sound. He still watched the tree line as if keeping a promise to those who could not keep watch anymore. Mason would sometimes take out Ranger's old tag, now cleaned and hung beside Atlas's service collar inside the cabin, and hold it in his palm. He no longer believed Black Pine had been waiting for him alone. It had waited for a witness. It had waited for a dog loyal enough to follow a memory through rain, stone, and silence. It had waited for a man broken enough to recognize what broken dignity looked like, and stubborn enough not to look away. By autumn, when the first cold wind returned, Mason no longer thought of the island as a place to disappear. People came here to be seen, to be quiet without being dismissed, to be wounded without being reduced to a wound. One night, as fog gathered over the lake again, Atlas rose from the porch and looked toward the old trail. Mason followed his gaze, expecting tension, expecting warning. But the shepherd's body was calm, his ears were soft. After a moment, Atlas leaned against Mason's leg and sighed. Mason looked out at the pines, at the repaired dock, at the warm cabin windows glowing behind him. Black Pine Island had never been cursed. It had only been waiting for someone to listen. And in the end, it was not money, power, or reputation that brought the truth home. It was a dog who remembered, and a man who finally understood that no life becomes worthless just because the world stops paying attention. If this story touched you, take a second to like and subscribe so more stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances can find the people who need them. And tell me in the comments, which moment stayed with you most, and where are you watching from tonight?